Hello and welcome to the Three Things I Know policy podcast from the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. I'm Alex Mortimer, the Research Engagement Manager. Now, the school has over 170 members of academic, research and teaching staff across 4 departments and institutes, one of which is the Department of Political Economy. And at King's as a whole, we have one of the biggest, if not, I think, the biggest concentration of political scientists, political theorists and economists of various kinds in the UK. And the purpose of this series is really just to talk to my colleagues about the interesting work they're doing and the interesting way in which their work intersects with policy topics, often very directly. And I'm really delighted to be starting with the colleague I'm here with now, because he actually works directly in public policy. Dr. Mattia Vanoni is Senior Lecturer in Public Policy within the Department of Political Economy. You've been at King's, I think, for 5 years now, before which you were at Bocconi. So hi and welcome to the podcast from the lobby of your conference hotel.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Very, very pleased to be chatting to you. So tell us first of all about your main research interests and how they have developed over your career.
So what I started in a kind of strange way is more a family story. So my family comes, like, we used to own some bakeries back in Italy, and my aunt was really involved in policy making when it comes to that area, also at EU level. I come across this nice story about the frozen bread. So apparently the EU was trying to implement some legislation that would say, okay, if you call fresh bread in Germany, you have to call the same in Italy. But in Italy, we have a long tradition of fresh bread. So they try to find like a loophole based on public health in that regulation, which is like some sort of, like the notion that you cannot freeze and unfreeze something twice. So you have to say on the label that it is fresh bread. And that gives a comparative advantage in the market to Italian bakers, because we have this tradition. So I got really interested in that area of lobbying, representing the interests, coordinating at EU level, and so on. I always wanted to work in the European Union, so I did it here in Brussels. I hated it. I hated the environment, and everything was like awful. So, but I still didn't mind the idea of studying it. So what I did is, like, I kept that interest in lobbying and focus on the European Union. And I came across like one of the most famous example, which is the tobacco industry, tobacco control in the 90s, the 2000s, like all the main introduction of regulation, curbing smoking in indoors areas, hospitality sector, imposing some restriction how you advertise that, and so on. So that's where my interest in tobacco control and lobbying started. Then I moved on to more generic business and politics. So the whole idea is to focus on business and government, and we start working with my colleagues in the European Union to see how business interests are represented. And what we find very differently from the US, which is where most of the work comes from, is that business in the EU is almost a social partner. So it is seen as a legitimate partner in the policy making. And for instance, we have a lot of work that busts the myth that comes from the US. But for instance, when it comes to revolving door, we see that in the European Union, we don't have as much as revolving door. In the US, actually, what we have is what we call sliding doors. So you have the fact that there's a neat separation between careers in the public and the private sector. Because in the European Union, what you need, if you are a firm, is someone that is representing your interest and that knows how the industry works. So most of the lobbyists, but for instance, they come from the sector. So that is what we did when it comes to business and government. And then I moved to a broader interest when it comes more generally the political economy and public policy. I will talk more about it in detail later on, but this whole idea is the use of models and methods that come from economics to study public policy.
Right, brilliant. I cannot emphasize enough to people listening. I have never heard this bakery story before. That is amazing. That's a great kind of progress of a research career founded in baked goods, which I can only approve of. So I mean, when I actually was looking back at I actually printed out your publications yesterday from the website, and that was, I had to actually go back to the printer and get the second page because I didn't realize how many there were. So you've mentioned kind of a key progression of some of your interests there, but of course that you've worked across such a wide range of things. So just apart from what the topics you've just mentioned, just in the time I've known you, you've also worked on free school meal provision in the UK. You've worked on access to healthcare for sex workers, on geographic mobility during the COVID pandemic. So you finished off by kind of mentioning methodology. I mean, is it basically methodologies that sort of draws these topics together for you? And what kind of methodologies are you interested in using?
Yes, indeed, because I've been moving from web scraping, web pages of sex workers to serving carers in schools and so on. And the whole idea is like this is all linked together about what we call the political economy of public policy. It is the idea, first of all, of using some models and methods from economics to study public policy, but that has also a computational approach to public policy. So what we use innovative methods to gather and analyze data that is then used to study public policy. So, for instance, when it comes to the sex workers paper, a lot of work there was involved in scraping those web pages. Those are like normal ads that are put online by sex workers, and we scraped them. We got their detail. We were very careful about anonymity. All these was ethics approved, obviously, but we got their contact number, and that's what we did. We sent by message a survey. And what we found is that when sex work is legalized, sex workers feels more entitled to ask for protected sex from customers, to report abuses from authorities, to interface more with the medical authorities and so on. So that is one thing, but that came by finding new ways to gather information that were not readily available somewhere. In this case, it's a small community, a vulnerable community, but still you need to get access to that. And I want to emphasize with the fact that you need to be careful how you gather the data, how you treat that data, and so on. Because again, it's a vulnerable population, so you need to be sure that you gather the data in a responsible way, you store it in a responsible way, and you use it in a responsible way. When it comes to middle school provision, that is again like what we use survey, but in that case we use social media to use what is called snowball sampling in survey. So we actually ask some groups, some guardians and so on, if they wanted to be involved in that survey, and we want to know whether they could actually forward the survey to their contacts. So again, the use of social media, of different kind of venues to get some data. In that paper, what we find is actually that with the school closure due to COVID, there was a switch in terms of meal provision when it comes to kids. So they starting to eat less healthy option. And obviously that was more pronounced when it comes to lower classes. So obviously, if you can't afford already to to send your kids to school and so on, you cannot afford also to provide some meals that are nutritious, they're healthy, and so on. So then again, just to conclude, is those are innovative ways to find and analyze data to study public policy.
Right. And what I love about this is, of course, policymakers, and you're going to know much more about this than me, are not necessarily used to working with those methods, of course, because they're very innovative. They're generally going to be using official data sources. So it's kind of an interesting idea, isn't it, to draw things like the kind of research you do alongside official sources that they might be using to investigate and analyze and create policy. So leading on from that, what are the three things? And I'm saying to everyone, this can be three things or it can be one thing, but I think you've probably got a number of things. What are the three things you wish policymakers knew about either something you've researched yourself directly, or could even be a section of the literature?
Indeed, as you mentioned, that kind of new data is important. So what we do with King's, I design and deliver an online course that is tailored to policymakers. And what we do, we study web scraping and text analysis approaches to public policy. The idea there is not that they are gonna become, researchers themselves or major expert in the field. But what I want them to become is informed users, informed customers. Because nowadays they get more and more information that come from those sources, that come from text analysis, come from the web, and so on, and they don't know how to assess it, they don't know how to use it, and so on. So it is very important as a policymakers to make an informed choice there. So the first point is simply that good data and methods are crucial for policymakers. And the fact that you don't, as a policymakers, you don't have to know how to use them, in a perfect way. You just have to know what is right, what is wrong, whether something makes sense or not. You just have to be an informed customer. The second one, it is more related to my research, lobbying, business, and government, and so on, is that don't take for granted the powerful interest always win in policymakers. Resources don't always matter. What we find from all our research in the European Union is that business interested are treated equally as NGOs. Reputation, legitimacy, and trust are very important. Here, I'm at a conference on regulation and governance, and half of the panels have trust or reputation in the title. Nowadays, even for independent agencies, trust and reputation are crucial. So as a policymakers, you need to be aware that different kind of interest will approach you in different way. But what matters is that credibility, transparency, and reputation are really important. The third point, it is more related to my new strand of research, strictly in political economy. It is about regulatory complexity. So more complexity leads directly and indirectly to more complexity, which most of the cases is not good for the economy and the society as a whole. So we have a bunch of studies that shows that regulatory complexity, so having long and convoluted pieces of legislation or regulation, slow down implementation, and more importantly, create the incentives for policymakers to introduce even more complex legislation, which makes things work in a sort of vicious circle. So the whole idea is how you write pieces of regulation, legislation, and so on really matters and have an important implication as to whether that legislation is properly implemented, enforced, and monitored. So the 3 point, the complexity one, the idea that good data and methods are important, and the fact that interest groups are all legitimate actors, and the centrality of transparency and credibility in policymaking.
So what I'm hoping from this is that people can take away a little bit of an insight into some cutting edge research. We've talked about some very different areas. We've talked about business lobbying. We've talked about school meal provision and how that was affected by the COVID pandemic. So thank you very much for talking to me, Mattia. I can hear your conference keynote in the background has just ended. So I'm going to let you get back to the conference. And we will. I'll talk to you again very soon. And if anybody would like to talk to Mattia about anything we've talked about in the podcast, His contact details and my contact details will be below this recording on the website.